In session number 6 in the house church planting in networks, we're going to look at what does leadership look like in house churches or in a network of house churches. Well, if you think back to the contextualization we talked about, you have to realize that it probably depends on the house church and on the network. Now, some people read the New Testament and believe we need to somehow slavishly follow the pattern of Paul in establishing house church leadership. But in reality, we have to realize that Paul actually evolved as he planted churches. His first journey, it seems like it was very quick and he just appointed elders. Later on, we see that there's elders and deacons. And finally, we find out there's Ephesians 4 ministers ministering in an itinerant manner. So we can just say that actually, Paul didn't have a singular method. Of course, Paul focused on church planting in urban areas, major metropolitan areas, Corinth, Ephesus, Rome. These were centers of complexity. And so people came to faith from lots of different backgrounds. And so he ran into the problem that there was a lot of division. In Corinth, this was particularly true, and that's where he added the new layer of Ephesians 4 ministers to try and get these ministers to go around so to be a cross-pollinization. The Ephesians 4 ministers would learn as they went around from house church to house church, but also they'd be bringing the wisdom of other house churches and insights from God to them as well. So Paul evolved an increasingly complex model. The thing is, I want to realize is that as apostles, as church planters, it's a creative enterprise. We need to create, we need to be talking to God, we need asking God, how do you want to do this? If Paul and his team had kind of wandered by a little village where 20 people got saved, just a little village and that's all there was, they probably would not have appointed elders and deacons and Ephesians 4 ministers. I mean, it's really not needed. It's just a village of 20 people and half of them are kids. Okay, so doubtlessly the structure of the community was already set up. So the important thing is that we want to just follow the Spirit and have freedom to contextualize according to how things have changed. If we're planting churches amongst a military community where they already have colonels and generals and captains, we want to follow that model. If we're planting it in an athletic community where they have coaches and things like that, there's already an authority model that we need to honor and respect, and we need to build the kingdom of God in the context in which that community lives. Remember, though, the church itself operates very simply. We said the 4 things that the church does. Study the teachings of Jesus, which are not highly theological. They're mostly practical. How to love your brother, how to love God, how to love your enemies. Have a lot of fellowship, usually centering around a meal. Remember the Lord's death and resurrection, so a simple Lord's table. And then prayer. That's all you need to do. You don't need anything more than that. So very simple. Having said that, I do plant churches in cities, and I plant house churches that need to network for strength, stability, and reproduction. Often in a network of house churches, you may have very wealthy house churches in the same network with house churches that are pretty poor financially. Likewise, you'll have different gifts in different house churches, and they need to share their gifts. So I'll just give a little brief overview of how we've tried to interpret Paul's pattern, but in a creative way. So I'm not going to give you too many details. We do appoint elders. These men have full-time jobs. They're not professional clergymen. As a matter of fact, in our house church networks, nobody gets paid. So the elders are responsible only for the whole house church network. They're not responsible for individual house churches. Their responsibility is to make sure that resources get shared. So if there's poverty and money is needed, money gets given to the elders who can give them to those who are in need in appropriate social ways that don't bring embarrassment or any difficulty. Likewise, the elders make sure that spiritual gifts get circulated, especially the Ephesians 4 gifts throughout the different house churches. So gifted people from one can go to another. They don't just remain in their house church. And so in that way, they actually see the resources of both finance and gifting circulate around. Elders also are responsible to make sure that there's appropriate oversight in each house church. Each of our house churches is overseen by deacons, male deacons and female deacons. Men oversee men, women oversee women. So the elders usually appoint the deacons and then take responsibility to shepherd and take care of them and make sure that they're getting strong. So in this way, networks of house churches connect with each other. Networks connect through other networks by elders of one contacting others. And so in this way, even networks can connect with other networks. But I just want you to understand that the goal is not to try and slavishly figure out what Paul was doing and try and apply it today. We can learn principles of leadership, plural leadership, different styles of leadership and whatever from the Apostle Paul. But we have a lot of freedom to apply these things. As a matter of fact, I would say you can't even really know how leadership functioned in the New Testament. There's not enough data for it. However, one of the real responsibilities apostles have is to recognize the first leaders. Paul appointed elders in every city before he left, and then elders may have appointed others. What are the requirements that we should be looking for as we appoint the leaders, which is probably way more important than what titles they get and what they do? 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 3, Peter says that elders are models, examples to the flock. The most important thing elders are is pace setters, first and foremost. So in that sense, they need to be models of those whose lives are being transformed into the image of Christ. You go back to the teaching on transformational ministry. As we go and plant churches, we look for those who are hungry after God, who want to see their life changes, who are able to look at their lives critically and say, my marriage needs changing. I need to change the way I interact with my employees at my job, or I need to change the way I interact with my boss. They're anxious to see their lives change and come into harmony with the teachings of Jesus. So the leaders need to be pace setters in transformational ministry. They're not hiding their sin. They're living transparent lives. When they're struggling, they're sharing and they're getting other people to help them. Leaders aren't those that are beyond struggle. They're ones that struggle the best, and they seek the most help when they're struggling. And of course, one of the major areas we look at is how are they doing in their homes. When Paul writes to Timothy about Timothy appointing elders after there's a big mess in Ephesus, and apparently they didn't listen to his warnings in Ephesians chapter 20, and a bunch of elders got out of line, and Timothy had to go back and appoint new elders. And Paul gives them kind of a list to look at, and there's a lot of little particular things on that list, basically saying look for good men. But there's one qualification he gives 2 whole verses to. He says the elder must be one who manages his own household well, chapter 3, verse 4, keeping his children under control with all dignity. For if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? You can tie that into verse 2. He must be the husband of one wife. So he needs to be a good family man, one who loves his wife, one who's devoted to his wife, one where the covenant of God with his people is reflected through the marriage relationship. And so that becomes a model for all those. I'm not talking about perfection. I'm talking about leading the pack. He's a model for those in the church, a model family man, a model husband who loves his wife, pours out his life for his wife, sacrifices for his wife, nourishes and cherishes her, and understands her. And then he also is a man who cares for his children, who watches over them, who has a plan for them, who brings them up in a discipline and instruction of the Lord, as it says in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, but in love. Not disciplining them harshly, but in love, developing them into whom they were created to be. The number one characteristic of a leader is that he be a good family man. Paul spent a lot of time in the homes of the leaders. We spend a lot of time in the homes of our leaders. If they do a good job in their home, they'll do a good job in the church. If they're faithful men in their home, they'll be faithful in the church of Jesus Christ, not trying to use it as a power broker, but as a way of serving both their families and the other churches. Leadership in a network of house church, it needs to be contextual. It can follow patterns of Paul, but should not be enslaved to them, and indeed should never sacrifice talent for character. The most gifted leader with terrible character should never be elevated to leadership position. Leaders need to be those who set the pace in their hunger for God and their transformation into the image of Jesus Christ.